geography and rural sociology from the UK. And her research interests include agriculture of the middle, you can hear about that, food hubs, and diverse agri-food economy. Her previous professional experiences include working for nonprofits in Oregon, Oregon, Ohio, and Texas. Please help me welcome Lilian Brislen.
Thanks, you all. So there's no microphones, but what's not in my bio is that my past life was also getting a theater degree. So are you okay hearing me in the back? We're good? Okay. Welcome to the show. Yeah, well, hello. And I don't know many of you, but thank you so much for the introduction. So most of this is going to be review of what you just heard. So if you take away 3 things about who was that spoke to us on Friday, I'm a rural sociologist, which means I study the social, political, economic side of agriculture and food systems. So not how to grow things, but why we grow what we grow or why we eat what we eat. I've been the executive director of the Food Connection for, this is now the 3rd year of our operations. We're a relatively new center on campus that's an outgrowth of the dining contract, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And I've had the delight and honor of working with Dr. Smith. And in my personal life, we work on an old house downtown. I have a mostly useless dog. I dress him up in the same Halloween costume every year because it never stops being funny to me. So that's who I am. And I'm so nervous, but also very excited to be here with you. So the plan today is sort of talk about local food a little bit for those of you who this is maybe a new area of thinking and talking, and then share some specifics from Kentucky. So why is local food a big deal? It's a rapidly growing market. So market research estimates that there have been 11.7 billion sales. This is sort of gross sales, retail sales in 2014 of what they call local food, and estimated to climb to over 20 billion in the next 2 years. So just incredible increase in sales. Farm sales, the farm sales portion of that, and these are again estimated numbers from 2012, were about 6.1 billion. So to put that in perspective, the entire farm economy of Kentucky is around 5.4, 5.6. So this is big business for farms. But what's interesting about this and why farm to campus and sort of agriculture of the middle or mid-tier value chains are interesting is that most of these local food sales are still through direct markets. So that would be farmers markets, roadside stands, community supported agriculture, and only 30% of the reported local food sales come from a mix of intermediated, so wholesale or otherwise distributed, and direct sales. But we do see a rise in interest in what we call institutional sales. So public schools, hospitals, campuses, and about 40% already of the school districts in the United States have some form of farm to school programming. And consumers really care. They're very interested. And there's sort of some common things about what they care about when we talk about local food. And a lot of the talk today is sort of dealing with how this is not, and speaking to a room of scientists, this is maybe challenging to talk about. It's not a hard and fast rule, right? A lot of what we deal with in developing these systems is navigating complex, qualitative, subjective ideas and assumptions about food and what's good and what's bad, as opposed to, did it come from close by? So when we ask consumers, and this is a 2012 survey of grocery store shoppers, or 2014 study of grocery store shoppers, why do you buy local food? Number 1, freshness, right? Fresh and local sort of makes sense. Number 2 is one of these kind of abstract or qualitative ideas to support the local economy. And what does support mean? Why should buying food why would they want to support the local economy instead of just get the best deal? And 3, taste. It tastes good. Maybe it tastes familiar. Maybe it tastes delicious. Maybe it tastes interesting. So we can dig into that. Which is all to say that there are a lot of tensions and negotiations that happen for those of us who are working either on a policy level or working with different purveyors or working to advocate to our administrators as to how we should integrate these informal systems or subjective assumptions and beliefs into very formal systems of procurement. So we can have some, there we go, fixed and quantifiable approaches to what is local food. So Geographic proximity is how I refer to it. A lot of people will talk about food miles, and there's some, I would say, no, it is true. There are false assumptions out there about that closer something is in food miles, it is better environmentally, or it is better in other ways, and that doesn't necessarily play out in some very newsworthy ways in the UK's history, which I'll talk about later. We could talk about the percentage of ingredients that have some sort of farm impact when we're looking at value-added products like soups or salsas. We could, we calculate the cost of ingredients by value. We could try to do an economic multiplier study to say what is the actual projected economic impact of a dollar spent in a local food system. So we could look at developing these systems through those lenses. When you talk to consumers and when you talk with community stakeholders, I think you're more likely to hear ideas out of kind of this area where we talk about fairness. I want to support local farmers, not just economically, but we want to have fair prices. We want to be fairness for workers, fairness for food access. We did a breakfast this morning over at Good Barn about local grocery stores, and someone was saying, what are we doing for food deserts? We saw in the past administration, this is hard to point with, this concept of kind of knowing your farmer, right? Know your farmer, know your food, a major USDA initiative. Why know a farmer? What do we gain from that, either personally or collectively? What does it mean to know your farmer? What do we want to know? How they're growing something? How much of it? Are we asking them their per acre yield on tomatoes? How does that help us? Why would that influence how we buy things or what we buy? But also, the sort of general community building was another common theme actually in this morning's breakfast. And so when we're dealing with farm to institution, and again, these formal systems of procurement, this is really hard to measure and to be accountable for and to be transparent about and to say, report on, how are we meeting our fairness benchmarks? And then we have some other ideas that I think are, yep, contested and negotiated. And this is the least social sciencey I will get today, I promise. But, we might have different ideas about what is a quality product. So I think beef is a good example of this, or really any animal protein, where quality standards are for pure white fat or for a particular flavor profile that comes from being fed on corn and grain, right? It's a sweeter meat, it has a less gamey flavor. And so that is an indication of quality, as opposed to people who prefer grass or forage finished products, which are going to have a yellower fat, which would be poor quality under the other standard. But for people who are interested in those products, that's an indication of quality. That gamey meat is gamey, that sort of flavor could be seen as delicious, could have seen as desirable. Notions of what is and is not sustainable. And there are a lot of assumptions that local food, I buy local because it's better for the environment, or it's more sustainable, but in what terms? And I don't think I have to tell you all this. This sort of sustainability, especially when it comes to agricultural and agricultural production, is hotly contested and negotiated by all stakeholders. And more recently, I've been hearing this kind of debate around within our state and within, sort of statewide players working in local food systems, that we need to be helping real farmers. And I can't tell you what it means other than I hear it a lot. So some folks would tell you that small, diversified, just a couple acres, well, that's not a real farm. I think we've all probably heard the term hobby farm. But there would other people who would say, oh, if you're pulling in $500,000 in gross receipts, you're not a real farmer, you're a big farm. You're like a mega farm, which you all likely know it's not true. But we have these sort of assumptions about who we want to be helping, who our real farmers are, what quality food is. And all of these assumptions and contestations and negotiations have to be accounted for within any of these formal processes and formal systems. Or, we can try, and we succeed to varying degrees for different ones. And for my own part, and maybe this will align with some of your own thinking, how I come to this work and what I think is valuable for it, and I think we could all agree, especially in terms of the land-grant institution, is local food systems are a way to support farmer livelihoods, in the sense that, this is probably a familiar graph to you all, but I show it to our students and it's kind of mind-boggling to a lot of them. So the blue line is the number of farms in the US from 1850 till the last agricultural census. The red line is the average farm size in 100 acres. So what we've seen, especially since kind of post-World War II era, sort of modern agricultural practices, is rapid farm loss and consolidation of farmland, right? So we're seeing fewer and fewer farmers farming more and more land, and that has consequences for our rural economies, for our rural communities. And I was reading last week the Main Street Outlook, right? The sort of regular monthly economic outlook that they survey bankers in agricultural counties. And so almost half of the bankers in this survey reported current corn prices below break even for cash renting farmers. Okay, so we're thinking about farmer livelihoods and why might a farmer consider moving into local food systems, sort of like, you know, real farmers. All right, so half of our bankers are reporting prices in their counties. They also reported that the farmland price index fell below growth neutral for the 47th straight month. So we're seeing a decline in farmland prices. Maybe some of this is sounding familiar to those of you with a historical mindset around agriculture. And 1 in 10 of those bankers expect farm foreclosures to be the greatest challenge to banking in the next 5 years. Which, as someone who grew up in the rural Midwest in the late 80s and early 90s, really starts to sound like farm crisis situation, right? And I think the trauma of that is still resounding in a lot of our rural communities, but that the more economic diversity that we can bring to agricultural livelihoods, the more opportunities to stabilize prices, stabilize incomes. That to me is a crucial piece of risk mitigation for any agricultural economy, maybe not every farm, but for some farms, and thinking about sort of the stability of our farm economies, that this is one tool in a broad tool box, yeah, of ways to stabilize farmer livelihoods. Oh, there we go, Rural Main Street Index. And, you know, the story of Kentucky is similar. So, and this is why I care about local food systems in Kentucky. I think it's commonly known that the tobacco transition, we are still continuing to look for ways to replace tobacco livelihoods, to maintain our small farm legacy, which we're very lucky to have here. Moving to Kentucky 7 years ago, it was an amazing place to come and do work with regional food systems because you still had regional farmers. So, farm and institution, the nuts and bolts of it. I thought this was good too, because we had Dr. Palmer in. I was like, oh, that's the actual institution here in our kitchen. So when we talk about farm to campus in particular, and UK's role in that, I like to review with people that we talk about dining contracts, and farm to campus meaning food that's coming to our dining operations. There are 3 main ways that happens at any university. There are self-operating systems, which we were up until 2012, right? The dining service is part of the university's operations. It's part of the finances and part of the employment. There are management contracts, which is what we have at UK Healthcare. So that's split off from the main campus dining contract. And that's where you hire in a company to manage those facilities for you, but you, as an institution, retain ownership, and those employees are your employees, but you have much more control over the day-to-day and the procurement strategies. And then there's a more formal dining service contract, which is what we have in the main campus with Aramark. And this is where you put out an RFP, you solicit bids, and then that company, that dining service provider, fully takes over your operations and is responsible for the investments and the employment and those sorts of things. And what we've seen across the nation is that the big 3 dining service providers, Sodexo, Aramark, and Compass Group, which Morrison's is a part of, who has our healthcare unit, they control 47% of US hospital dining services and 21% of colleges and universities. But the college and university market is the growth market for these dining service providers. As, you know, in changing political and funding contexts, as universities look for creative ways to finance their needed infrastructure investments, you know, and we'll talk through those numbers, that this is how they do that. And that's really what we saw here at the university. And when talking about how does local food happen in farm to campus, there are some models that we can look at. So there's 4 kind of ways that typically happens. You could have an internal corporate responsibility, I mixed up that acronym, anyway, corporate responsibility program where, Aramark has these around cage-free eggs, or, local food for us. We try to source local whenever we can, or we aspire to have sustainable seafood. So this is, the least stringent. There's ASHI STARS, which is again self-reported, and that's the American Association for Sustainability in Higher Education. And they ask, how much should you source locally? How much should you source organic? And it's self-reporting. They put it up on the website. There's the Real Food Challenge, which is a nationwide kind of grassroots nonprofit organization that has a very extensive and rigorous definition of what they constitute as real food. And again, thinking about these sort of contested ideas of what constitutes real food and real farmers. And they work with a number of universities, but mostly smaller institutions. And they have a more formal working relationship with Sodexo, which is sort of the major competitor of Aramark. And then we can look at contractual obligations. So writing local food procurement metrics into the actual dining contract, which is what we have here. So how does this actually play out in institutions and the way we approach it? So similar to the last slide, there are sort of 3 types of laws or agreements that you can have. Just to reiterate, there's this sort of encourage language, which is non-specific or enforceable. We try to buy local whenever possible. You'll hear that a lot when you look at local food. There are preference policies, which would be specific to say, and you can do this for food, you could do this for any sort of vendor, that you give a preference to local food or local vendors if it's not more than 10% more expensive than the non-local competitor. Or you can have targets or benchmarks, which are financial or percentage benchmarks, so either 1.6 million or 20% of purchases, which those benchmarks we often refer to as, I learned this bureaucratic jargon in the last 2 years, KPIs, or key performance indicators, and that's what's written into the contract. So you negotiate these KPIs with your dining service provider, and that they have to be met by the end of the institution. And so states will do many of these. We have a number of laws on the books that our state parks should, they should try to buy local food when possible. But even though 37 different states have laws like this, and institutions will have these, very few, if any, have actual enforcement mechanisms. So what we can learn from any sort of policy is without an enforcement mechanism, it's not much more than goodwill. So how did this look at UK and what did we learn? So we, as a university, changed from self-operating, we talked about that, to a private dining contract in 2012. And Scott Smith oversaw a lot of this process. And when the announcement was made that this transition was going to happen, there was significant student concern and community concern. A lot of you were here and involved in that process. There were public forums. I think Rebecca maybe hosted some of them through the Tracy Farmer Institute, where people said, well, what does it mean for our role in the food system? What does that mean for our role as a land-grant institution, our obligation to our farm economy? And so out of that, a lot of pretty, I would say, innovative or forward-thinking agreements came out of that. So when the contract was signed, it's for 15 years. So we're in year 3, year 4. I'm in my 3rd year of employment, so we're in year 4. Thank you. Thank you to my help in the front. So when the contract was signed, there was about $85 million agreed to for renovations, new construction. You've probably hopefully visited us at the 90 and seen the fresh food company there. About $10 million in revenue sharing that happens through rebate systems and other forms of revenue sharing. And most importantly for me, there was an agreement to provide $5 million over the 15 years of the contract for a food institute. And so this is part of the academic integration and the sort of land-grant mission component. So the Food Institute became the Food Connection. Excuse me. And then most pertinent to our talk today, these KPIs with performance metrics with cash penalties for local foods. So unlike a vague aspirational goal, they should try to buy local food. They said you should buy this much every year. It's going to increase by 5%, and if you don't, there's going to be a penalty involved. So that, that's a pretty innovative approach. In the first year, so then we had to, the university had to decide, well, what is local? Again, these contestations and sort of assumptions that go into it. So the first round of local food benchmarks said that there should be 1.2 million in Kentucky Proud and additional 800,000 in local food. And then those should increase by 5% every year of the contract. So Kentucky Proud is a state-run program, and that's out of our Department of Agriculture, started in part during the tobacco transition as a way to market and promote Kentucky foods. But that includes, Kentucky Proud includes anything raised, grown, or processed in Kentucky. And what we learned is that vendors are Kentucky proud. So you can be a Kentucky proud vendor, but that doesn't mean anything for the actual, all of the items that you sell. But there's this assumption that, you know, when you deal with your food distributors, you're Kentucky proud, everything you sell is Kentucky proud. And then local was defined as anything sourced from Fayette or a contiguous county. That's our little circle there. And that was a definition that was inherited from the self-operation. So to set a benchmark for, well, how much did we buy local last year? What's local? You know, stuff nearby, geographic proximity. And they pulled numbers from the old database. I imagine, I don't know for sure, I imagine it sort of happened by zip code. Give us all the sales that happened from vendors in these zip codes. And that's how these benchmarks were set. And then what happened? Who knows? Coca-Cola! So we made some good headlines. And this was, I had been on the job not a year, maybe 6 months when this started happening. And so I said, whoa. This doesn't meet our implicit assumptions for what local food should be. But there's a bottling plant here in Fayette County. So this prompted a lot of these interesting conversations about what do we mean? Why do we do this? Why do we care? What's the university's role in this? So as you hopefully also saw, better headlines, I should put those in here too. After the second year of the dining contract in the past, so during fiscal year 17, there was a renegotiation thanks to stakeholder input, thanks to, stakeholder input, care and concern. And the dining metrics were revised, and they were based in part on the classifications that Dr. Smith and I developed during that first year, during the Coca-Cola years, to say, okay, so clearly Kentucky proud and this geographic proximity of local aren't really giving us the insight we want into what are we buying, where is it coming from, who is it benefiting. So we developed an alternative set of metrics that look basically like this. So it's a two-part metric. Every item, so first and foremost, we deal at the item level, not the vendor level. So you can be a vendor who maybe redistributes some orange juice, but also manufactures chocolate sauce in state, true story. So we would look at the farm impact of the product and the business impact of the product, because the two areas of local food systems that we think we can all kind of agree on is we care about supporting farmers and helping the local economy, which we see reflected in consumers' interests. So for the farm impact, we classify things as majority farm impact, meaning 50% of the ingredients by cost can be traced back to an identifiable Kentucky farm. Some farm impact, 10% or greater, which was kind of an arbitrary benchmark. And all farm impact products, so either some or majority farm impact products now in the new revised dining metric must total up to 652,000 and some change. So this is for the past fiscal year. So that's how that works. Anything that doesn't count as a farm impact product then goes towards the broader total. Does that make sense? So this is the overarching for the past fiscal year. This is the grand total, and the farm impact is a portion of that. Yeah? Okay. So business impact, we look at, is it a Kentucky business? So is it majority owned and operated by Kentucky citizens? Do they have major operations here in the state, and are they Kentucky citizens? And we also have a classification for a Kentucky located processor. So not a Kentucky owned business, but they have some major value adding. So they're turning flour into bread, or they're turning, I don't know, flour into bread's a good example. So we classify every item by those. And these are some of the things that come out of that. We've got coffee, not grown in Kentucky, which you all know, but it's roasted here, so that counts as a business impact product. We've got Prairie Farms Milk, which is a multi-state dairy cooperative, but a majority of the milk from that plant is from Kentucky farmers. So that's a some farm impact product from a Kentucky located processor. We've got Chelsea's Eggs, which is, she's a UK alumnus who has pasture-raised eggs, and this is probably the most quintessential when we think of local food. It looks like this, but we've also got Pilgrim's Pride here in the state, which is one of the major chicken integrators in the world, but they have a processing facility, and all of the contract producers for that facility are located in the state. So, and then we've got Wonder Bread. Is Wonder Bread local food? Well, it comes from Flowers Foods, a co-packer located I think in Bardstown. I should look up where it actually is. And they produce Wonder Bread there at the facility. So, you know, this is sort of like you make your bed and then you have to sleep in it. This counts as a Kentucky located processor. So there's some business impact there, but no farm impact. So it's complicated, tensions and negotiations. And then when I don't know why this didn't come out. This didn't transfer well to your PowerPoint. So this, when we looked at last year's, this is the dining report that just came out. This is all of UK Dining's purchases. That includes the stadium and the Chick-fil-A's and everything. 8% of the products they bought had some farm impact. I think it was 4% had only business impact. Is that accurate? I don't know why these didn't come through. Oh, I've got it on here. Oh, 6% had at least some business impact, and 4% of those purchases were reclassified, meaning that we learned at some point later in the year that they were coming through a Kentucky vendor. Again, this is why the item versus vendor level matters, but were not being produced in Kentucky, so they would not count. But more importantly, it kind of looks like this. So we see that when the actual foods come through, it's a lot of meat. It's a whole lot of meat. It's a ton of dairy. And very little produce. And most of the farm impact products that are sourced through this contract are variations on Southern Belle milk, so either fluid milk, cheese made from that milk by Boone Creek Creamery, or the ingredient in Alfredo sauce or potato chowder. And then Pilgrim's Pride chicken is the primary farm impact meat source that you're seeing here. So what are the challenges and opportunities for our farmers? And I don't know if you can read this cartoon. I thought you might be like a cartoon crowd, but I don't know, maybe I misread it. Anyway, it says, let's stop arguing, we're both here now. And I think we have this idea of, oh, do we need to grow? We need to have more producers before we can have a local food market. Oh, we need to have more local food demand before we should tell our farmers to grow more local food. And the point is it all has to happen at the same time, right? We need to have, you know, like any good brooding operation, we need to have chickens and eggs happening at the same time. That's a good extended metaphor. So when we come down to the doing of local food, so the title of today's talk, I think of it a lot as a square peg, round hole situation. And a lot of the work that we're doing and our other statewide partners are doing is trying to sort of round that square peg. What I mean by that is local food systems and all of the economic relationships and the networks that go into it work best, or they have grown out of a system that, as we saw in the earlier numbers, really emphasizes direct-to-consumer and short supply chains, long-term planning and seasonal planning for the growing season, so making arrangements long ahead of time. They offer unique and differentiated items that can garner price premiums in the market, and that they use diverse, in lieu of federal risk management programs, although we've seen some growth in that recently. We use diversity both in terms of products on the farm, so having eggs and produce and other things, but also in terms of markets, so having the farm stand and the CSA in a lot of different markets, that's the primary form of risk management. As opposed to the more conventional supply chains, which our institutional partners are accustomed to, which have global, long supply chains and those sorts of markets and the prices set through those, standardized and interchangeable products. So instead of specialty and niche, we want, you know, the standard tomato that comes in the box and we're used to it always being the same size and always being the same flavor and available year round. Just-in-time ordering, so instead of having long-term planning with our suppliers and putting the broccoli, you know, asking for how much broccoli we're gonna have ahead of time, we wanna buy what is ever cheapest and available off the terminal market. And using insurance and certification as risk management. So having liability insurance and having these sort of formal risk management strategies. So what works best, or if we're looking to farm to campus possibilities, how do we kind of mesh those systems together that don't naturally work together? And that would work best through looking towards, instead of win-lose relationships where I get the best price, haha, I got the lowest price, I won the food system game, we can look towards win-win relationships. So negotiating, well, I really need to get X for my broccoli harvest, does that work for you? We can look at food system capacity building, so looking at our infrastructure around produce processing or looking at our beef infrastructure to help move a product more efficiently. looking at regional specialization. So what do we do really well here in Kentucky, and how can we help integrate those products? So maybe sorghums, or some really innovative wheat work, or the incredible cattle herd that we have here in Kentucky, and our beautiful grass and the meat that it can grow. And a lot of our work at the Food Connection is using transparency and accountability as a way to foster understanding, to foster further collaboration, to hold ourselves accountable for, are we reaching the end goals that we want to see? So the assumed barriers are often that it's going to be price, you know, things, local food's too expensive, it's not available year round, there's probably quality problems, and they can't produce enough. And those factors certainly come into play. But in looking at it in a more nuanced way, what we see is that there's challenges around inflexibility. You know, so, and this is the rounding the square peg problem, that we're really working with our institutional partners to help them perhaps, hopefully, become a bit more flexible in the way they do business. And I'll work through each of these a little more in depth. So value chain coordination. So getting the different, we have lots of innovative entrepreneurial partners across the state, but how do we get them connected? How do we connect the dots of our existing infrastructure and entrepreneurs? How do we get our growers up and running at the speed that would let them kind of on-ramp into the wholesale market? And how do we get our community educated to have these sort of nuanced understandings, but also continued and long-term support for this work? So when I say inflexibility, and I have the Liberty Bell here, so we have discovered, and I just being candid about our experience today, that there's, rather than this sort of local adaptation and bringing in what's in season and having menu items that work well with the particular growers that we have, what we see is national control, so that the corporate headquarters in Philadelphia, that the menus, the recipes, and even the negotiations with new vendors are happening with national level stakeholders, so the national office, as opposed to our local representatives. So there's some challenges that come there, and especially sort of the time frames in which those negotiations happen. It's a long road to kind of challenge the expectation that local food systems will just integrate seamlessly, or to have the same sort of expectations of local food systems and local products that we do of products that come through a global supply chain. So this would be a preference on the part of institutional buyers. Well, I just want to get all of my cheese, which we can do, right? All of the cheese served on the pizza in the cafeterias comes from one vendor. I want to get all of my tomato sauce from one vendor. So moving large volumes from single vendors is the preference. Well, we can do some of that. But local food systems, again, thrive on diversity of suppliers, diversity of products. And because the menus are set at a national level and sort of, they are atemporal in a way, right? We can have strawberries in January in that sort of worldview. It's hard for us. We can do, apples are in season, right? Who likes local apples? Everybody. They are the gateway drug to local food for any child that I interact with, right? Oh, I don't like food, I don't like fruits, I don't like vegetables, because they've only ever had a gas station apple that just tastes like camphor and is gross. So when you always have apples on the dessert stand, if you have apples available year round, it might be challenging to 3 months out of the year, 4 months out of the year, have really delicious, super amazing local apples that are totally cost competitive and are a great thing to have. And then what happens the week when you switch back to the conventional apples? Then people might not, they might realize, oh, these are gross. I don't want to eat these. And so there's some challenges that come that way. And in particular, the way that purchasing and distribution happens. And why that is that there's three main ways that a dining service provider will get its food. They have a broadline distributor, which is Cisco, right? The biggest distributor in the world. The relationship between Aramark and Cisco is so tight that they have representatives in each other's corporate headquarters, right? These are all but one company in a lot of ways. And they have a secondary distributor who is for supplemental purchases. So this would be for a lot of the fresh produce and specialty products. And this is Piazza, an Indianapolis-based company for us. And both of these distributors will have, I call them rebates. I'm not sure what the other buzzwords for it are, but you know, you get sort of a percentage kickback if you do so much of your purchasing. It's kind of like rewards points, but to the tune of millions of dollars. And then there are direct purchases that do happen. And initially coming to this work, I thought, oh, well, no problem. They can get most of their stuff through those guys, and then we'll just connect them with individual growers as it makes sense for these kind of one-off opportunities, these innovative things. Boy, was I naive. So direct purchases, rather than for sort of one-off little opportunities, are really used for those vendors for which they have such huge volumes of purchases that it's worthwhile for them to negotiate direct purchasing as opposed to work through those distributors. So what we see come through direct purchase, instead of 5 bushels of apples, is all of the milk, all of the coffee, things that college students eat a ton of, right? Cereal and coffee, and donuts, surprisingly. Also a lot of donuts. Nothing we should be surprised that they go through a lot of on the campus. But it can be very hard for our growing and developing local producers to get into these systems. So it makes it hard for us to pull product in, and there's a lot of requirements that I'll talk a little bit about. So what we need to do is get our growers as best as we are able into those systems. And early on, we did a study of produce production in the state. And this was 2 shocking graphs to me. So I had our graduate assistant just pull census data to say, like, okay, well, how does Kentucky rank in specialty crop production versus our neighboring states? And we came back with number of farms, and I was like, okay, we're looking pretty good. We got more farms in Tennessee doing, this is fruit and vegetable production, combined numbers. And then we get over to the actual acres in production, and this is staggering. Does this surprise anyone else? You all knew this? Well, you knew. I didn't. And so when we talk about supply side bottlenecks in Kentucky, we've got lots of farms, but they're not putting many acres. And I think sort of comparing us to Tennessee and West Virginia is helpful. So there's a lot of room to grow. That's what I'm trying to say. So one of the things in particular as it comes to farm and institution sales is what I think of as the GAP gap. So GAP is third-party food safety certification. It's a market-based, it's not a federal regulation, that's FSMA, that's a different talk. But GAP is required by Piazza and by most wholesale distributors and buyers. And it's a third-party audit that looks at on-farm food safety practices. So there's costs involved. There's costs for the certification, there's costs in labor time, there might be some infrastructure investments. And up until recently, a lot of our existing wholesale growers were being grandfathered in. So that, oh, it's okay, you don't have GAP, we're still buying from you. But really in the last 2 years in particular, sort of, we can't do that anymore. So making the leap from established direct markets or relationships you have with restaurants who aren't going to require that, so sort of small wholesale, making the leap into capital W wholesale is big, and you're taking on that risk without the guarantee of having sales at the end of it. So you're kind of stuck in between. You're too big for direct markets, and this is another kind of agriculture of the middle phenomena. You're too big for the direct markets, you can't sell enough through the farmers markets, but you're not quite, you have to, this is what I want to say. To make the leap to GAP, you kind of already have to be a fully running wholesale operation, right? You got to have your post-harvest handling figured out. You've got to have your coolers in place. You've got to have all that in place so that they can come through and check you off. Well, there's no good on-ramp to getting fully up to speed to wholesale production. So you fall in between this gap of, does it make, the gap. They'll follow me. Yeah, you got me. So what we have done as part of the Food Connections work, and this is sort of addressing these problems, is this Cultivate Kentucky partnership. So this is a partnership between UK, the Kentucky Horticultural Council, and the Farm to Table coordinators, and we recently, we work a lot with the Food Systems Innovation Center and Paul Vijay Kumar over there, and we just announced a USDA NIFA grant for the next 2 years to help us expand this program. So what we're doing is, the start of the program was one-on-one technical assistance to help farmers. Look at, this is from one of our actual farmers. Look at all these clipboards of like checking off that you check the toilet paper in the bathroom, and that you check the mouse traps, and that you check the temperature on the coolers. There's just a lot of doing that has to happen for you to be GAP certified, to sell the distributor, to get it to campus, kind of working back through these food systems. So Brian will go out and help kind of translate the bureaucratic jargon of the GAP certification, calm nerves, hold hands, help fill out checklists, help write food safety plans, so that we can have more farmers ready and available in that system. And we do that also in coordination with a mock audit through the Department of Agriculture, so that farmers can be fairly sure by the time they're going to actually pay for the auditor to come out. So the typical cost of an audit is for a, a wholesale size farm, it's around $1,500. So, and this is an annual fee. They want to be sure that they're ready and it's going to be worth those $1,500 to bring the auditor out. But there's also some cost sharing through KDA, which is really fantastic and helps sort of mitigate that risk of making the leap. And in Brian's first year working with us, we've helped contribute to a 125% increase in the number of GAP audited farmers. And what helps create crazy numbers like this is if you start with a really small number, so then any change makes it really, I think we've gone from 6 to 12, I think, if I've got the numbers right. So we're seeing a strong farmer response, and I think it's a program that's working well. And what's, as the rural sociologist, what's different about on-farm food safety is when your tractor breaks, you can call one of your neighbors, right? There's this pool of what we would call tacit knowledge. This, everyone knows it. You learn it from your auntie or your uncle, and it's kind of out there and you can ask your friends. Well, no one's gone through the paid paragraph B subsection 2. You can't call up your neighbor and say, hey, what did you do for that when you filled out your form? Because we don't have this pool of farmers who have gone through the process. So building this ready pool of, we're trying to also contribute to that. We also are trying to look at, so value chain coordination, meaning that connecting the dots of the food system, our existing entrepreneurs. And we've tried this with broccoli. We are still waiting. So we thought it would, a lot of this work is like, surely it will be so simple. We could just, and then, eating our hat every time we say that. So broccoli is used every day in the cafeteria. And it's actually something that Kentucky growers can do a pretty good job of. But when we said, okay, well, let's look at, if you want to only deal with products that you use a lot of, let's look at what you use and let's pair that up with what we know our growers can do. So we came up with broccoli. So well, we need to know, our growers need to, they're not gonna put anything in the ground that they don't know is already sold, because they're smart farmers. Don't plant it unless you've already sold it. So we were trying to ask our dining partner, well, how much do you use a month? And the answer was, well, we don't know. And I said, well, can you find out? I don't think so. How do you figure out how much broccoli to order? And so because the way they're ordering system, again, this is the square peg, they've never had to know that before. And so we continue to work with them to kind of calculate that. So we eventually came to a calculation of their best estimate, 1,200 pounds a month. Okay, so let's say that let's have a conservative estimate. Let's go out with 800 pounds a month. So then the grower can turn that into succession planning and having them in the field and working it backwards. So working back through the production to actually putting the seed in the ground. And it was shocking to me that our produce distributor currently had no Kentucky broccoli offering. So we were, again, bringing a GAP certified farmer, doing the planning, getting them into the distribution system. And once we did all that, then we had to wait for the growing season. And then about every week or every other week, I would provide regular follow-ups, which I think was just pestering them, but I'm okay with that, to say like, hey, how are we doing on broccoli? You guys still planning to buy it? Yeah, probably. Week later, you guys still planning to buy it? Yeah, probably. We'll see when it comes in. Well, then finally, we got the first harvested, and I was so excited. And I told everyone, yes, it's actually on the trucks. We got the email from the distributor, and then they opened the boxes up. And it was terrible, you all. It was yellow, it was stinky, and there was some post-harvest technical assistance that needed to happen. So like, hey, broccoli is really gas sensitive, it's super heat sensitive, and so now our grower is going to ice the broccoli, and we're gonna get it up to quality. So all of these pieces, again, the chicken and egg problem, we have to like tend to the chickens, feed them, and then go run back and make sure the eggs are still being incubated, and then run back out to the chickens again. And so, fingers crossed, hopefully next week I can tell you that the broccoli actually made it to campus. But these are all the different pieces that had to happen along that line. And so finally, in conclusion, what are the sort of next steps looking forward of what does farm to campus look like for us here, particular at UK? This is my best attempt at a agricultural metaphor. So what fruit are we going for? So the ground fruit, we've disqualified items. That's a victory, right? Coca-Cola is no longer local food at University of Kentucky. Let's relish that. These are our ground fruit. These are our deer apples. And we've seen that in the current catalog of Kentucky products that our dining service provider buys, they've sort of captured the low-hanging fruit of conventional supply chain items raised or processed in Kentucky. Pilgrim's Fried Chicken and Southern Belle, huge ticket items for UK, but that's probably, you know, they've probably bought about as much as they've maxed out on that. And then we've got yearly increments that we need to increase purchasing. So where's the growth going to come from? Oh, that's our Pilgrim's Fried. We're starting to see in this past year the intentional development of our mid-sized producers. So our Cultivate Kentucky work with getting our growers on-ramped into the wholesale system, and also specialty development of farm impact products. So we've got a produce processor who's making a Kentucky tomato ketchup. Ketchup is a vegetable. But we've also seen a local co-packer integrating sweet potatoes, or trying to find, we've seen new hot dogs developed. They joke about how many hot dogs that Kentuckians eat. I didn't know that, or Aramark does. Anyway, so we're starting to see those supply chain innovations. This is where the entrepreneurial edge is starting to come in, year 3, where we're needing to see growth. And this is our never-ending broccoli quest. And then where might we never get, or what are going to be the hardest items to reach? And these would be sort of the quintessential idealized notion of what local food is or should be. And I'm putting that in quotes, right? This is sort of like idealized notions of these small scale, third-party certified sustainable or other premium products, like that stuff we love, the high cost stuff, the stuff that makes us happy. Not bourbon, but we could think about organic farms, right? So Elmwood Stock Farm isn't currently selling anything to the university, maybe out of the price point, but we could think about ways that we could integrate those on a specialty level, so catering or other products. So this is, you know, the food system itself is diversified, and we relies on not our deer apples, but, you know, integrating products where we can. So the 3 takeaways, the 3 C's for Kentucky Farm and Institution initiatives, as I understand them. If we're going to do this well, we need commitment. I think the benchmarks and the enforcement mechanisms are the only reason that we're seeing progress, and I think it was a really forward-thinking university. We need consistent metrics. So having apples-to-apples comparisons across institutions lets us say, how are we doing compared to EKU? How are we doing compared to Norton Hospital Group? And we've had some great developments with the Department of Agriculture along those lines. And we need to continue to foster collaboration. So doing this value chain coordination work, having open conversations about what we need as far as price points, what our long-term intentions are, and building that trust and reciprocity. So there's room for everyone in this work. There's room for our dining partner to continue to evolve and move from convenience, you know, low-hanging fruit, to commitment and those long-term relationships. There's room for entrepreneurial development and development of new products that sort of meet that sort of rounded square model of the supply chain. We should continue to work with our growers to help them develop new enterprise lines and make wise infrastructure investments on those farms, you know, what makes scale-appropriate solutions. And there's a role for the university and extension in continuing to foster local food system development around technical assistance, either through things like Cultivate Kentucky or other programs, professional development for our agents and different service providers to help them understand the needs of this system, and to help continue to educate our community so that we can ask the questions about, are we getting where we want to go? Great, so that's my whole talk. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to take questions. Any questions? Yeah. No, it didn't get bought. Yeah, it just stayed on the truck, or I think it probably went to the compost pile. It never made it to UK. So it never made it to campus, as far as I know. The distributor picked it up, and then when they got back to the warehouse, realized it was a no-go. So really, they should have checked it at the field, is my understanding of kind of standard operating procedures. So that's a great question. But I know at least the farmer, that was kind of on them, right? Like if you're not, which is harsh. Does that sound harsh? Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that's why we need the diversity. I mean, there's an argument for having diversity of suppliers, so they'll just go to the terminal market and get broccoli from wherever they normally get broccoli from. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So dollar-wise right now, it's like, well, you said most of your dollar-wise local spending.
Yeah. So I'm trying to get to that chart for you. Very little comes from the South Farm. Last year, a little over $1,000. I looked that number up before I came here. And that's kind of one of the, I think, the downsides of this story is that, and there was nothing from the butcher shop. And so that integration of university grown product hasn't happened, and I would say in large part because of that distribution system that we're describing. So our research farm had to sell to Piazza, who put their markup on it, who then had to bring it to UK Dining because that's the way they do business, right? And again, direct purchases don't happen the way that I would logically, you know, it's just these different systems. So, yeah, is it a feel-good story? Not at that level.
Is there room for
Boy, I would hope so. And I think that what we've learned more than anything is that our dining partner and the university as a whole is very open to public comment, if that's a tactical way to say it, so that when concerns or interests and voices are made heard, that there is a responsiveness that happens there. So I think especially, yeah, the louder those voices are, that's when we see change and adaptation happen. I would love to see more of it. I think there were some disappointments early on with South Farm integration. It's sort of like the figuring out the logistics of those relationships and systems that maybe there was some frustration across the board, and maybe we could revisit that. I would love to see it. I think I might be being too vague. Absolutely. Yeah, so we have an endowment that lets us give out student opportunity grants every year. So these are for students or student faculty teams to do research or different projects around food systems. So that could be anything from researching best practices in sweet potato deep frying, which was one of my favorites. Like, how does that work? To archaeological digs in Eastern Kentucky, looking at ancient Kentucky foodways. And so that's a resource that we have available to us. We teach our own for credit course. That's part of the Hunger Study Certificate. I mean, I didn't go into the Food Connections work. We have a learning kitchen that was also part of that major investment. So we have this sort of Food Network style, beautiful kitchen and a chef who runs the programming there. Last year, we had over 2,000 people come through the kitchen to do different cooking classes or lectures or those sorts of opportunities. We host on-campus field trips. So a lot of Gen 100s will come through and do a cooking demo, or I'll do a lecture. We do, what am I missing? Gen 300, send us your 300 level students who need, don't send us, send us students with an interest in food systems if they happen to need a 300 level course. So Dr. Smith and myself and our chef Tanya Whitehouse teach a full semester course that's issues in food systems. So every week Scott and I trade off lecturing. Last week he lectured on the nitrogen problem, Corn Week, and sort of like issues, you know, and so a agronomist and a rural sociologist meet in the classroom, and what happens next will blow your mind, right? So every week we lecture, and then in the second half of the class we prepare food. They learn culinary skills related to that topic. So during the labor week, when we learn about slavery in the shrimping industry, then they have to actually rip heads off shrimp and devein them and pull the legs off and kind of get that visceral experience, and also make this amazing dish at the end. So we teach that. And we have student interns. We have graduate assistants that do work with us. So through the Food Connection, that's sort of the academic integration piece as they see it. But I think there are lots of opportunities to look at actual dining operations. We're trying to have conversations with the business school about how do we work in some of their auditing and operations analysis into our work around the dining report and those sorts of things. Yeah.
Has there been any discussion or movement towards considering cooperative for like the post-harvest processing, and those types of things to help with this gap. I mean, we're seeing the same thing in tobacco. The gap programs they're just driving everything towards huge operations.
I was reading those numbers before I came here too. So I guess the average tobacco size, you know this, I'm just saying it, that, you know, it used to be 3 to 4 acres was typical, and now we're looking more at 25, 30 acres of tobacco for those who are still growing it. So yeah, that's sort of consolidation of production. Does tobacco have the same troubled history of cooperatives that produce does in the States?
No, because the cooperative was actually mandated until 2004.
Well, right. Yeah, you've got good feelings about co-ops.
It was federally mandated, so you didn't have this issue with people breaking ranks.
Yeah.
With the co-op or whatever.
I think there's incredible opportunities there, and again, this is like what is economically advisable is not always socially possible, which is, you know, attitudes, beliefs, perceptions, concerns drive a lot of farmer behavior. And, you know, if we call, you know, could we come up with other terms to talk about it? So there's examples of, we took a group of agents and specialists back in April to look at what they're doing in North Carolina around local food, and there's some really innovative things happening. And there was a food hub in Waynesville, outside Asheville. Anyway, it's called Tractor, and they're doing shared use packing, processing, post-harvest work. So you can essentially lease or rent the packing room that's attached to the food hub, which is essentially working as a distributor. So the food hub's distributing the product. They're not taking over the processing, cleaning, washing, packing, grading, but they have shared use equipment that farmers can come in. So it's sort of a middle road between a fully cooperative model and a fully standalone model. So I think we could look at examples like that, but my understanding is that there's sort of a sour taste in the mouth of Kentucky producers around vegetable co-ops and fruit co-ops because of things that I wasn't around for, but you probably all know. Yeah.
Going back to the good story question, it's more, you can't find farm impact good stories so much as you, but you can find good stories. They tend to be the processed foods and Frankenboom ice cream and sweetgrass and all of that. And you could even call coffee a good story, but it's not farm impact.
Yeah.
But it's an individual with a local business. And so those things seem to be easier in a sense. And maybe the good story question was more about UK connections, but there's a strong difference. So the barriers are different.
Yes, because processed products, if we think of this value added line, those fit well into an institutional dining model, right? These are always available. Ice cream is available year round. And Frankenboom is a great story. So that's made with JD's Country Milk. It's a local Lexington, you know, second generation food entrepreneur, and they do great things. But yeah, this is in some ways the easiest to integrate because these value added products need to be in a distributor. They need to be going to grocery stores. They can't just set up a store shop. Custom Food Solutions is a co-packer out of Louisville. They make what worked well in that model, so that was well accustomed to this sort of square peg, is that Aramark sent them their spec recipes. So Aramark determines this is the soup that we use and this is exactly the recipe and you must make it this way. Well, Custom Food Solutions already makes co-packs for people. So they were making Aramark spec soups. All of the soups are from them. And so that's a lot of what's coming in. Not a lot of, but there's a significant chunk that's coming in there. So those sorts of things work well. Our existing businesses that can adapt to that model. We're seeing, and then some of that sort of mid-tier fruit where we're seeing some farm impact products introduced, isn't, a lot of this is dependent on the people involved. I mean, as much as we want these to be rational, you know, autonomously operating local food systems, we need people who are interested. It's not, you know, if we've learned anything, it's not that easy, right? It takes, you have to be excited by it. You have to be committed to it and passionate about it to sort of be willing to experiment and fail and have the broccoli you have to toss away or have the soup that turned out gross. So because we've got this committed partner and because Custom Food Solutions is interested in, it's a Kentucky-based company, so they have an interest in working with Kentucky producers and growers and they see opportunity there as opposed to a non-Kentucky soup company. So that's where some of these local economies work in collaboration with each other. So he's introducing products like the cheesy chicken that's made with sweet potatoes, or the tomato sauce that has Kentucky sourced tomatoes in it because he's making that for our vendor. And so this is where we're starting to see that innovation is in some of the processed products. But man, the wicked problem is really is produce. And you know, is hamburger a good story? What do you think? I mean, so we have a 75% Kentucky sourced hamburger available at K-Layer. That's the Kentucky Proud Burger. It's 75% because of USDA regulations around beef trim. That's my understanding. Is that accurate? So we don't have a source of Kentucky trim, which is the fat that you mix back into the ground muscle meat to get the desired fat percentage. So they serve a 80-20 burger. Is that accurate? Is it? Somewhere in there. Doesn't matter. Anyway. No, that's it. You're 75-25. That makes sense because it's 75% in fact. Duh. So that's the beef story, right? And I'm trying to, I don't have those slides on here. It used to be this really convoluted supply chain that went back and forth across the state 5 times before it finally ended up in Kentucky. And then through some of that value chain coordination work, we said, well, how about Clem's gets the beef from Boone's, turns it into a hamburger, brings it to the university. Nice, simple supply chain. And because they do enough volume in hamburger and because they do enough volume in meat in particular, they were willing to set up one of those direct buy relationships. So again, that's where we see some of the opportunities. If we can simplify those supply chains, we see more results. Any other questions?
Really, why don't you see if Princeton does
How do I do that?
this is singing like-
Oh, Princeton, do you have any questions?
Any other questions? Yeah, David. But this, well, maybe not possible, but this process be easier and our market. Trying to their local market and plus their local
Well, I wouldn't have a job. So I think in the most literal sense, not that if I talk about it, I would have a job, but sort of, yes. There is certainly flexibility that comes with being self-operating. And some of the most successful, this is recorded. This isn't me saying it. You can look to the literature. And some of the most successful university dining operations are self-operating. So University of Minnesota, we can look at University of Illinois, Duke, what's the other one? Ohio State. Man, if you tour their facilities, that's really outstanding. But I will say that Ohio State was able to keep in meeting with them, they kept dining self-op because they privatized parking services and got a major, even more gigantic cash infusion as a result of that. And so there's certainly trade-offs that happen. And we could look at the hospital in the UK healthcare system that's under a management contract. Say, well, we have more influence and control there because it's a management contract, but absent a contract, absent expectation of public reporting and benchmarks, it's, so we haven't seen that progress there, even though the opportunity is there to do so. So
I put you in an odd spot.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to, you mentioned the square peg round hole issue. We're trying to work with our farmers that maybe square into a round hole that is
Mm-hmm.
guideline. Curious the impact that has been on our local food, trying to make our farmers conform. Maybe they can't. It seems like I'm asking, I guess what I'm gauging is how big of a barrier is it?
I think not as much as I may have made it out to be. I think there's real opportunity. I mean, local food is a growing market, and I think getting into the wholesale system and continuing to work with those different supply chain partners to help them help everyone across the system, help farmers understand what the university needs, help distributors understand what the farmer needs. And so the more that we can develop those long-term and collaborative relationships, I think those barriers start to fall away really quickly. And so when the university said, yes, we want broccoli, suddenly it happened. And so I really think that those long-term commitments and strategic planning around developing products that are going to work well, and so instead of willy-nilly kind of throwing the spaghetti to the wall to see if it's done approach to the food chain, we should say, okay, what, that sort of regional specialization, what do we do well here? What can we grow up at scale? So sweet potatoes are a thing that we can do really well. We could be doing a lot around season extension. We could look at hydroponics. We could look at increasing our produce processing. So if we had much higher quality IQF facilities in the state, we could be looking at a lot more year-round sourcing of those products. And so I don't think, and we're seeing for less, So if we look at the food systems, Fayette County Public Schools did 36,000 in fresh produce last year, which makes our 18,000 number look pretty small. Norton Healthcare over in Louisville has committed to buying Kentucky grown produce every month of the year. So they focus on one product every month, but they're doing it year round. And I think those sorts of incremental developments that create commitment, stability, predictability, so that we can assuage the risks and the concerns on the farmer's end, that sort of thoughtful development, I think we can see incredible results. I think there's real opportunity. Yeah.
So I mean, I agree, there's amazing power in the corporate model, but it gets applied in a different way. So when McDonald's and Aramark decided they were going to do cage-free eggs, millions and millions of dollars were invested in cage-free eggs. But when slavery and shrimp from Thailand was exposed, the worldwide certification program, because Aramark and others insisted that they be developed. So it's a global operation, applying pressure and change at a global level. Much less so, I think it's self-operated, more flexible than local level.